Escaped Sapiens.
Disgust is a pretty versatile emotion. We get disgusted by bugs, grubs, certain types of food, political opinions, and moral taboos. There's sexual disgust, cultural disgust, smells, and sounds. How do all of these relate to each other? And why do we crunch up our noses when we feel disgusted? In this episode of the podcast, I speak with Dan Fessler, who is a biological anthropologist at UCLA who specializes in disgust. We talk about the role that disgust plays in shaping our communal, social, sexual, moral, and political behavior, as well as the way that disgust sensitivity varies across genders, species, political orientations, and cultural lines. This is a good one. Hope you enjoy. Well then, if you're happy and you're relaxed, Dan Fessler, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Before starting proper, I really have to ask one question in particular, which is, as someone who researches disgust, the coronavirus pandemic, as horrible as it's been for many people, for you, has it been in some sense a really fascinating laboratory in which to see some of your theories of disgust sort of in action in a real life scenario?
So during the pandemic, we have been attempting to investigate a number of questions related to behavior during the pandemic and people's perspectives on the pandemic. In my lab, we haven't pursued questions of disgust so far relative to the pandemic, but we are setting up a collaboration with Josh Ackerman at the University of Michigan, looking at disgust reactions that may be relevant to aspects of the pandemic, and in particular, one possibility that I have speculated on previously is that our evolved disease avoidance psychology and the corresponding behaviors is actually poorly suited to a disease like COVID-19, because viruses like SARS-CoV-2, that is highly transmissible respiratory viruses with some measure of lethality, may be evolutionarily novel in the history of human beings, because in order to persist in populations, they require fairly high population density. Mm-hmm. If you have more isolated small populations, they may move through a population fairly quickly and then die out. And the greater the lethality, obviously, the more rapid that process occurs. So humans are our species is about 300,000 years old, approximately, but it's all really only in the last 20,000 years or so that we've had high enough population densities conceivably to support these kinds of diseases. That's because, it's probably really only in the last 10,000 years even, but the domestication of plants and animals only began about 20,000 years ago, and it's that enables high population density, because if you make a living by hunting and gathering the way our species did for most of its history, and some contemporary humans still do today, then for most ecosystems, there's some exceptions like the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, but for most ecosystems, resource availability is just not sufficient to support large populations that are sedentary, that stay in one place. If you're, gathering tubers and hunting animals, then if there are a lot of you, you have to move fairly frequently because you've eaten up the available resources. If there are fewer of you, then you still have to move, but just with lower frequency. And those, the best reconstructions of ancestral populations are that groups were embedded within groups. That is, that they were networked to other groups. There was long distance trade and exchange. People moved between groups. So disease could conceivably move between small groups, but the total populations were fairly small, and those interactions would have been intermittent. So a disease like this one, which either you die or you recover fairly quickly from, may not have had the opportunity. Presumably, zoonotic diseases repeatedly, throughout human history have jumped into human populations, but it wouldn't have had the opportunity to become as widespread as this is now. And that means that diseases like this may not have exercised selective pressure on our disease avoidance psychology. And, if you think about it, the idea of air being contaminated invisibly and undetectably really is hard to kind of get your head around, right? I don't know if this is right or not, but I read somewhere that a mathematician had calculated that all of the SARS-CoV-2 virons in the world would fit inside a soda can, right? That's how small they are, right? It's just mind-boggling, right? Well, we can't really get our heads around something like that being in the air that you can't see, you can't smell, you can't hear, right? And so it's possible that we're just poorly prepared for it. And our disgust reactions instead are targeted toward, pathogens that are not respiratory tract pathogens per se, but rather gastrointestinal pathogens, for example. We're very sensitive to feces and vomit, some pathogens transmissible through urine and so on, right? That is, bodily fluids are very prominent and seemingly universal disgust illustrators. And I say seemingly because the evidence is, far from conclusive on that, but it seems likely. And those have nothing to do really with, a disease like this, right? So with Josh Ackerman right now, he previously has published some work on sounds that are disgusting. And we're continuing to pursue that to see whether, in fact, things like breathing, for example, or even coughing, are not inherently disgusting, but the sounds of defecation or vomiting, those are disgusting. You might ask why we're using sounds, and the answer is because we know that visual stimuli can be very, very, salient as disgust elicitors. But of course, there is no visual stimulus for a respiratory tract infection, right? You don't see anything after that person has exhaled. So, long answer to your short question, which is there are really important scientific questions about disgust and its relationship to disease avoidance that are very relevant to the pandemic. My lab hasn't been investigating those so far, but we're starting to work with others who have.
So do you have examples for behaviors that seem maladapted? Like, are there things that you can readily point out that people are doing that seem to be, illogical from the perspective of stopping the disease transmission?
Yeah, so there actually some aspects of our evolved psychology are very relevant, particularly now as in, the fortunate countries of the global north are starting to open up more as a consequence of vaccine availability. And that's that, and this, again, is not my own work, but that of colleagues. There is emerging evidence, some evidence from baboons and some evidence from human beings that there's a basic problem that any living thing faces, and any organism that has agency, that moves in the world. Okay, I mean, plants actually have similar kinds of problems, but their decision matrix is somewhat different. But anything that moves in the world has competing goals with regard to how to use time, energy, attention, right? These are zero-sum resources, okay? And sometimes the problem is just one of allocation. The more you do something, the less you can do something else, okay? But sometimes the goals are inherently incompatible. And one of those would be the importance of social interaction and social support in a social species like our own versus the importance of disease avoidance, right? So one sure way that you can avoid, getting COVID is be a hermit, right? Never interact with another person, and you won't get COVID, right? Because it is, it doesn't persist long in the environment. It's person-to-person transmission, right? But obviously, in any social species like our own, social interactions are really, really important determinants of fitness, right? That is social support in political contests, whether they're, violent or nonviolent, is just a characteristic of social animals with complex behavior. All, social primates have these political alliances. The kind of insurance policy aspect of social relations is really important, so that, who takes care of you when you're in need? What does need consist of? Well, you're sick, you're injured, or, particularly salient for humans, you just came home empty-handed that day. So a basic feature of hunting and gathering societies is that they all have essentially mandatory sharing rules. You can't keep the stuff for yourself. You have to share it with other members of your community. And the reason for that is because there's too much variance in production, particularly with regard to hunting, for it to be sustainable without sharing. Because even the best hunter will come home empty-handed some days, right? But if we pool resources across a number of hunters, then the likelihood that all of us go hungry is much, much smaller. Okay, so it's a basic feature of the way of life that characterized human beings for 99% of our species history, that resources get pooled this way. Okay, so social support is really, really important in a wide variety of aspects, and we see that in fundamental aspects of human mental and physical health. So we know, for example, that that loneliness is a risk factor for for things like depression. But it's also a risk factor. It's very likely that this is one of the things that determines, for example, disease severity in COVID-19. How much social support do you have, right? And we're actually this week we're launching a major COVID study, not related to Disgust, that includes measures asking, what kind of social support do you have? Because the health psychology literature is very clear on this. Okay, across the board, we know that positive social interactions thus are really, really important. And we know that, social interactions are the way through which disease transmission for many diseases, including this one, occurs, right? So we have a basic conflict there, right? You can't maximize outcomes on both goals, okay? Now, sometimes those kinds of conflicts in natural selection, when they have been chronic, as it were, when they are an inherent feature of the trade-offs between goals, natural selection resolves those for the individual, as it were. That is, it's not a decision that the individual needs to make, so much as it is that the prioritization of those goals automatically shunts effort toward the pursuit of one or the other as a function of need. Okay, so to choose a readily accessible example in the Disgust realm, think about how you feel if you've just had a big meal. You're full, and you're quite satisfied with everything, and you're enjoying a dessert, maybe some cookies or something, and you knock one of those cookies off the plate and it falls on the ground. Okay, and maybe you're dining at an outdoor cafe, or you have a lot of dogs in the house or whatever, and the floor is kind of dirty. Okay, and it falls on the ground. Okay, and you look at that cookie and you think, cookie's kind of dirty. Well, that's all right. There'll be more cookies in the future. Okay, but now imagine if you haven't eaten in 2 days. Okay, your reaction to the contamination of that cookie is going to be entirely different, right? And in fact, sometimes it's said that hunger is the best appetizer. That is, food tastes really, really good if you're really hungry, and the scope of things that appeal to you will be much larger, right? My wife always says, don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry, because you end up buying all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily buy. Oh, that looks good, right? Your prioritization between, getting calories and nutrients versus avoiding disease shifts as a function of your current need state. Okay, and it does that without you thinking about it. You don't say to yourself, well, I really need the calories right now, so I think I'm just going to follow the 30-second rule and blow on that cookie, and that'll make it clean enough for me to eat, right?
Your hunger naturally modulates your disgust.
Well, there's an algorithm that is calculating which of those priorities gets pursued. And it doesn't, I mean, using that kind of language makes it sound like it's very mechanical. It can be simply a function of distributed information processing in a neural network, that whichever set of neurons is being more strongly activated wins out in the prioritization. At least in the early days of working on neural networks in cognitive science and in describing metaphorically the way that this parallel distributed processing can work, investigators use the metaphor of demons, right? Where all the demons are yelling. They all have a goal, okay? And when there's one network that is yelling louder, its voice gets heard. So obviously it's a metaphorical description of what's happening inside a network. But something like that is acting as if there was a built-in decision mechanism that prioritizes one of these goals over the other. Okay, now let's go back.
We have actual tests. Sorry to interrupt you. We have actual
Sure.
tests that can sort of see this network behavior in the brain.
Oh, that's beyond my scope. So I do virtually no neuroscience. I mean, I have 5 toes on each foot. They range in size from the big hallux to the little tiny baby toe. And the tip of my baby toe occasionally dips into the neuroscience waters, but that's not really what I do. So I can't speak to that.
Okay.
I do know that in, for example, artificial intelligence, that building what are at least conceptually similar systems of distributed processing through networks is one of the sort of principal tools in building artificially intelligent systems, right? There's no homunculus. There's no, in your brain, there is no person in charge, right? They're just a whole bunch of neurons networked together, okay? And different constellations of neurons are performing different adaptive functions. So there's, and we know anatomically, disgust seems importantly related to the insula in the brain, for example, but none of this is stuff that I do. I'm just a consumer of this information, and I would say not a very good systematic consumer at that, okay? Because time allocation problems. I mean, I'd read neuroscience all day if I had another life or something, but I don't. So now let's get back to the pandemic, right? And the kind of pressing problems in front of us. Well, what's happening as economies and societies are starting to open up, and we've seen this occur repeatedly. There have been attempts to reduce lockdowns and so on. What do people do? They rush to see their friends and relatives. Okay. And they say, I need to see them, right? And I totally understand this myself. Like I'm not just an investigator. I'm a person, right? I mean, I miss my daughter and son-in-law. I miss my grandchildren. I miss my brother and sister-in-law, niece and nephew, and so on, right? I'd love to go and see them. Miss my father. But the problem is when people rush to see their relatives, they don't see them as disease transmission risks. Right? That is just like the cookie when you're hungry just doesn't seem dirty. Okay. Well, how could it possibly be that, that my granddaughter, how could she be infectious? That
my loving father.
Exactly. Hey, it couldn't possibly be, right? I mean, that is because the trade-off has already been performed for you. It's not a decision that you make as to how those goals get prioritized, because close social relationships are so important and have always been so important in human survival, right? Political alliances, mutual aid, insurance, all of these, economic, continuity, all of these things that are just fundamental to the way that our species has existed for the majority of its history. That's a very high priority. Okay. And essentially what we see sort of historically in epidemics and pandemics is it's only when things are just completely, just all hell has broken loose and people are dying right and left, often in, sort of gruesome fashion, something like Ebola, for example, or, the Black Plague. then what starts to happen is sometimes the bonds of society all break down and people kind of do every person for themselves thing. They abandon their families and things like that. It doesn't always happen, but it has happened historically, periodically, when things are really, really, really bad. And under those circumstances, it may be that your close friends and family members seem like they could be contagious. That is, you're just, you avoid everyone. Mm-hmm. But short of that extreme circumstance, it's very hard to get your head around the idea that those individuals are contagious. Okay, so because the algorithm has already performed the trade-off for you, and so one big risk that we will start to see happening essentially right now, as you and I are speaking, and we have seen episodically occur when lockdowns have been relaxed over the course of the last year and so on, when precautions have been reduced and so on. Lockdowns are just an extreme version of precautions. Is that the first thing that people do is they go and see their relatives and friends, and they don't treat them as if there's a disease risk, and then you get transmission. Right?
Mm-hmm. This, I suppose, this is one of the reasons why I started to become more interested in the topic recently, because I'd be walking along with someone I knew, or I'd watch someone who I had known for some time, who would avoid strangers like the plague. They'd see someone without a mask on, they'd be disgusted, and they'd want them to keep away. But the second they bumped into a friend or a family member in the street, they would immediately act as though that person isn't capable of transmitting the disease. I guess on the other side as well, sadly, I also saw people, not friends, but people I know, who would avoid Asians and this sort of thing. So really loony behavior. And I guess that's when I started thinking more in depth about disgust. But actually, before going in that direction, I want to take a step back. And I want to ask, how did you actually start being interested in the topic more generally? Outside of COVID, taking a step back, what was it that first caught your attention?
Well, it's a long time ago, so I'm trying to reconstruct what the actual history was. But I think that there were two sort of, phenomena in the world that just caught my attention and had me scratching my head. And one of them was pregnancy sickness, sometimes called morning sickness, so the nausea and vomiting in pregnancy, right? Where concentrated in the first trimester, women not only experience nausea and vomiting, but their taste preferences change. They develop aversions as well as cravings. And that whole phenomenon just seemed really puzzling to me. Like, what is going on there? Okay. And I'm happy to share the ideas I had at the time, which were kind of in parallel invention by myself and some other investigators. We were just overlapping with each other. Paul Sherman and Sam Flaxman had a piece that predated mine. We were working on the topics at the same time. I'm not entirely confident that those ideas are right now, but the idea was, I'm not certain. Let me put it that way. I don't know the answer. The idea was that, and here again, we have a sort of a trade-off between goals. Okay. So, internal fertilization and gestation are, really, really fancy, adaptations. Well, they're parts of adaptations because they allow for reproduction in a way that the conceptus is buffered from the environment, right? If you're an oyster and you just put your eggs out there in the ocean, right? Well, lots of things can happen to them, and you can't maintain your investment in them. You can't keep investing more and more. Okay, so these are huge evolutionary innovations, but they come with a problem inherent in them, and that's that your immune system, patrols your body looking for foreign material, basically, looking for pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites that have gotten in there and attacking them. And by its very nature in sexual reproduction, the conceptus is only 50% related to the mother, right? So you have a problem. That problem is there's huge benefits to, gestation, but there's this immune system that has to do its job, and it attacks things that are not me, right? Well, that trade-off gets resolved in favor of reproduction, in that the immune system is damped down in some important ways. It's modulated, right? And this is, one of the reasons that pregnant women need to take particular precautions about. And in fact, if you go to the grocery store, if you, at least in the United States, and I would imagine probably in the EU as well, if you look at soft cheeses, there'll be warning labels saying, or packages of meat, for example, right? There'll be warning labels saying pregnant women need to exercise caution about these. Cat litter has always got these on them because cats carry a parasite called T. gondii that causes a pretty significant disease in during pregnancy, right? So there's this modulation of the immune system that allows tolerance of the half-foreign conceptus, right? But at the same time, it's happening at kind of the worst possible point, because the conceptus is, by virtue of the fact that it is developing rapidly and it's early in its developmental trajectory, it's very vulnerable to insult. So if you think about an arrow like leaving a bow, okay? And imagine that you have some sort of superhuman abilities and you can flick the arrow while it's in flight. If you give it a little flick when it's, 1 centimeter away from the target, well, it doesn't really make very much difference in terms of where it ends up on the target. But if you give it a little flick just when it leaves the bow, it's going to miss the target and the hay bale entirely, right? So the earlier in development that any perturbation of the trajectory occurs, the more significant the outcome will be, okay? So, this is a bad time to start becoming more tolerant of the possibility of infection, as it were, right? Well, you can't, there's no way to resolve that trade-off in terms of the goals of gestation, right? But there is something else that you can do, and that's that you can increase the cost that you're willing to pay for behavioral avoidance of possible sources of contamination, okay? Because there's always a trade-off. Think about the cookie on the ground, right? Do you eat it and get the calories and the nutrients, or do you avoid it and reduce your risk of ingesting pathogens, okay? There's a trade-off between those two things. Well, the more that you invest in disease avoidance, it comes at costs. It comes at energy costs. It comes at attentional costs. It comes at opportunity costs, whether you eat the cookie or not, right? What economists would call an opportunity cost, right? So my idea, and Paul Sherman and Sam Flaxman's idea, was that these changes in the first trimester reflect an upregulation of disease avoidance during a period of vulnerability, right? So you to tolerate the conceptus, you have to change some functioning in the immune system, but you can try and compensate for that because it's now worth paying more to avoid disease behaviorally, okay? And subsequently, that idea, which was developed by my colleague Diana Fleischman and I, we subsequently came to call it the compensatory prophylaxis hypothesis, that basically you would expect there to be an increase in the motivation to avoid cues of disease as a function of vulnerability. One version of that has to do with, what is the individual's intrinsic capacity, what's the quality of their immune system. But another idea of it, and the one that Diana Fleischman and I developed, was that progesterone is the hormone that is rising in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle after conception. The opportunity for conception has taken place around ovulation, and if conception and implantation occur, then progesterone keeps rising into pregnancy. And so our idea was it's progesterone that is the proximate cue, or the proximate trigger of this change in investment in behavioral avoidance. Okay.
So do you see that with the pill as well, then?
Well, the actual amount of progesterone in the pill is very small. Okay. Mm-hmm. So in fact, the pill contains, the modern pill contains very, very low levels of exogenous hormones. It doesn't take very much to keep ovulation from occurring. Okay.
But say, for example, you didn't care about ethics and you just gave someone a bunch of progesterone. Would you expect that person to become extraordinarily disgust sensitive? Or?
So that was the hypothesis. And we had results consistent with that hypothesis. And I was fairly confident that the hypothesis was right. And this is, we're now talking in terms of, this personal history here. We're now talking, a decade plus after I first became interested in pregnancy, right? Now we're looking at changes across the menstrual cycle, right? Because levels of progesterone fluctuate. They're very low. Then ovulation occurs in the middle of the cycle. If the woman is naturally cycling of reproductive age and has an ovulatory cycle. Not all cycles are ovulatory. And then about a week after that, progesterone starts to rise. If conception and implantation take place, then progesterone continues to rise into pregnancy. And if it doesn't, then it drops off. Okay. And it's known that progesterone has some immunomodulating effects. Okay. For example, yeast infections tend to get worse in the mid-luteal phase, right? And autoimmune diseases that are characterized by excess inflammation, things like rheumatoid arthritis, for example, get better, and they get better in pregnancy. Okay, there was sort of a priori reason to think that the system might work this way, and I and other investigators were collecting increasing evidence that this was that this compensatory prophylaxis hypothesis was right, that the more progesterone that was there, the more disgust sensitive a woman would become. And then Benedict Jones in Scotland, who had he and his collaborators, Lisa De Bruyne, others, they had previously collected evidence that supported the compensatory prophylaxis hypothesis. They did a really well-designed, a well-powered study, and they didn't find any evidence in support of it. Okay, so now we're back to, and then since then, some other work has been published that says, well, maybe there is. Okay, maybe progesterone is.
Were they using animal models or something different to you?
No. They were using humans with very precise measurements of including hormonal assays and right. So I mean. It was a very well-designed study, much more thorough than anything that either Ben and his colleagues or I and Diana had done previously. Okay, so right now, if you're a betting person, I would bet against the compensatory prophylaxis hypothesis, at least this version of it. Right, the other versions which have to do with what is your immune system doing right now. Like if we give you a vaccination and we turn on your immune system to really, fight aggressively against the antigen, is that going to change your disgust reactions? That there's less work in that area. There is some work on just what is the person's basic immune profile, sort of how competent is their immune system, and how does that relate to disgust, and that tends to support this idea, right?
So do people with compromised immune systems also become nauseous and have signs of disgust? So, for example, are people with AIDS or people who've been through chemotherapy, or the problem is there are confounds there. Okay, that is the disease state or the therapy itself affects other aspects of the system. So that by itself, those kinds of interventions by the world, as it were, those are not a ready avenue for investigating this, right? But there's natural variation among people in terms of their immunocompetence in individuals who don't have any substantial disease, right? There's no autoimmune disease that's affecting that or something like that, and there is some evidence. I wouldn't say it's definitive that both between individuals and within individuals as a function of changes in them, that disgust sensitivity compensates for lower efficacy with regard to the immune system's ability to protect from pathogens. But I wouldn't say that we have conclusive kind of take to the bank evidence on any of these different facets of this idea. It's very plausible that one way or another that some of this compensation is taking place, right? And I mean, just think about the cookie example, okay, right? So if you're,
if the algorithms in your head can regulate that trade-off based on the hunger signals and the your indications of caloric availability, there's every reason to think they should be sensitive to what's going on with your immunocompetence as well. So it's not unreasonable to suppose that the systems are designed with that trade-off in mind also. But I would say that at present, and now we're talking, 20 plus years since I first got interested in the topic, right? I don't know, it's, and going back to pregnancy, it's very likely that pregnancy sickness, the nausea and vomiting of pregnancy, that's a byproduct of it. It doesn't have anything to do with progesterone. Yeah, it's not progesterone at all.
I guess another group of people would be organ recipients, right? Because they're not, they're not well, but I imagine they're not sick the whole way through the remainder of their life after receiving an organ, and then their immune system is greatly reduced, right?
Yeah, it is. That is, they have to take medications for the rest of their life to suppress. It's the same problem as pregnancy if you think about it, because if you got somebody else's kidney, it in many ways it's like having an embryo in your uterus, right? That is, there's something that isn't you that's in you, and that will be attacked by your immune system. And in fact, the genes that are critical in regulating, or not in regulating, but in allowing for the self-other differentiation, they're called the major histocompatibility complex genes in humans, and they're highly variable. So it's the most variable part of the genome from one individual to the other, because those genes are coding for the cell surface proteins that are the sort of secret handshake that tells the body, yeah, I'm part of the team, right? And so they have to, it's like any good password, it has to be very variable, right? It's called the histocompatibility complex because it's about the compatibility of tissues, right? So you're absolutely right that organ transplant recipients are immunosuppressed exogenously. Now, how does that affect their disgust reactions? I don't know that particular population has been studied. It's possible that it has. I don't know. But the drugs themselves may have other effects, right? That is, and people are told you are at risk of dying if you get sick, right?
Right.
Because
so they avoid.
So and this is something that we haven't talked about with disgust, is that it's not that that the mechanism is there and it's fixed. It is like most aspects of the mind, it is very susceptible to learning, right? We as a species, we're not particularly formidable creatures, right? We can't run very fast. We don't have big teeth. We're not huge. We don't have big claws. Our success as a species hinges really on, two things, which is cooperation, as I said earlier, and the ability to learn from others, and cumulative cultural evolution, whereby, the group develops increasingly successful ways of addressing the challenges in its environment, right? So, anything that's important about human psychology is going to have a learning facility in it. It's going to be built in there, right? Humans have always occupied very diverse ecosystems, right? And our predecessor species did as well. It's not that they only lived on the savanna. That's, certainly was an important crucible for human evolution. But, as populations grew and expanded, they moved into lots of different ecosystems. And the history of humanity is living in many, many different environments. Well, there are going to be some things like feces and vomit that are going to be a disease risk wherever you are. And there are going to be a lot of other things that might vary from place to place, okay? And including things like how you prepare particular foods. It's edible and even palatable if you do it one way, and it's dangerous if you do it another way, right? So the systems they have built into them the possibility of learning. Well, your doctor tells you, if you get a common cold that other people get, you might die, right? You can adjust your frame of reference and your behavior, and you do that long enough, and it will start to be that you are more disgust sensitive. You're not just, self-consciously enacting those rules. And clear evidence of this, for example, are food taboos, right? So, if you're a devout Muslim or a devout Jew and pork is taboo for you, the prospect of eating it may be nauseating. And I've actually seen where people ingested it without realizing it, right? Devout individuals who, there's a mix up, right? And they didn't, there was miscommunication and they vomited. Okay. That is, and it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to stick my finger down my throat because I understand that I have unintentionally violated this taboo and because I want to follow the taboo. No, it was, I am absolutely disgusted by what has happened to me. Okay. So, the system is very, very amenable to learning in some dimensions. So, organ transplant patients, not an ideal population to study the question of, how much of the algorithm is doing the work, automatically by gauging immunocompetence and adjusting behavioral prophylaxis, because they already know. They know long before they have the transplant, right?
So it sounds like it's really hard to find a control group for any sort of study then. I mean, it must be very tricky.
I mean, there's natural variation. So there's naturally occurring variation in people's, the effectiveness of their immune system. And then there are non-disease causing interventions like vaccination, right? Where you're provoking an immune response, but there is no actual disease, okay? And the fact that there is no actual disease is important because you want to differentiate information in the brain that is only coming from the immune system, and that's changing how the body and the mind, interact with the world versus any intrinsic consequence of the infection itself. Right. So, it's not that these experiments, or studies can't be done. They can. They're just a lot more challenging than the kind of thing that folks like me who, end up sometimes looking under the lamppost, right, have done where, we ask women, where they are in the menstrual cycle. We show them some gross pictures and, we make comparisons, right? It's a lot easier to do that work.
Yeah. So, you've mentioned that there are a few different types of disgust. So how, I guess there's disgust of insects, there's disgust of smells, sexual disgust, even political disgust and moral disgust. How do these relate to each other? Are they the same emotion? Is it the same brain architecture that controls these emotions?
So the answer is yes and no. As far as we know right now. And I'm not being coy there. I mean that in the sense that that there is overlap, varying degrees of overlap between all of these things that English speakers call disgust. Okay. But there's also evidence for divergence and specialization. So let me start with insects. Okay. And this is work that I've been doing for a few years with my colleague Tom Kupfer, who's at Nottingham Trent in the UK. And we have been working on differential reactions to ectoparasites and to pathogens, more specifically to cues of the presence of ectoparasites and cues of the presence of pathogens. Because if you think about the behavioral responses that are adaptive in protecting against these two fitness-reducing features of the environment, the effective behaviors are really different. Okay, if there is a pathogen in your environment, avoidance is your initial thing. Just stay away from it, right? And if you've been contaminated with it, then cleaning, right? Try and clean yourself. But the big risk, of course, is ingestion. Okay, and that's the big risk for two reasons. One, that's the principal way that stuff outside of us gets inside of us, right? You got to eat to live, and that means that parts of the world are going to get inside you. Okay. And the second is that if your immune system's job is to attack things that don't have the secret handshake, the cell surface proteins coded for by the majohistocompatibility complex that tell the body this is a healthy member of the team, right? If you don't have that, then the immune system needs to attack it, right? Well, how can you eat and do that? Because you're constantly ingesting proteins that are not you, okay? And the answer is you have to have some system that says, oh, stuff that came in through this one portal is really different and we should treat it differently. And in medicine, it's called oral tolerance, which is basically that things that enter your body through the mouth are not treated with the same degree of aggressive defense as things that get in other ways. Okay, because you'd constantly be developing food allergies otherwise, right? That is, your immune system would build antigens to foreign proteins that you've eaten. Okay. And most people have no food allergies, and arguably even the prevalence of food allergies in technologically advanced societies today is a feature of evolutionary disequilibrium. That is that we live in a world that's just too different. It's too clean, importantly, and so our immune systems are badly calibrated. But that's an aside. The point here is that stuff that comes into your body through your mouth has to be treated differently, or you couldn't eat and stay alive. Okay. And the consequence of that is that that's the big risk factor for contamination, right? That's where pathogens can both get in because you're taking outside stuff in, and they can proliferate because you're kind of looking the other way from the perspective of immunity. It's not that the gut doesn't have all kinds of immune defenses. It does. But material has to be tolerated to a degree that it doesn't have to be tolerated elsewhere in the body. Microbes, the big risk, and this gets back to what I said earlier about the possibility that we're just poorly prepared for respiratory viruses, right? As a disease threat. The way that microbes can get in and do a lot of damage is principally through the mouth. And so nausea, what is nausea? Well, it's reducing your appetite. So right away it's saying, the importance of getting food has now been reduced relative to the importance of something else. And that something else is, we seem to be in the presence of pathogens. Okay. And vomiting, of course, is the kind of last-ditch effort, right? Like, we might have gotten it
quick as well, right? I mean, when you get food poisoning, you really do feel it quite quickly.
So food poisoning, right now we're just talking about disgust, right? So we're not talking about food poisoning. Food poisoning utilizes the same physiological system, but doesn't have the same psychology attached to it. So if you get food poisoning, you will feel nauseous and may vomit, but you're not necessarily disgusted. Okay. You might be disgusted by your own vomit or something like that, that's just a byproduct. There's nothing, your own products shouldn't necessarily disgust you very much. I mean, be a mistake to ingest your own vomit if the whole function of vomiting is to get rid of stuff, right? There are species that do that. So
dogs do it.
Canids, right? Exactly, right? Because they don't have hands. They cache their young. The way that they bring food back to their pups is in their stomachs, right?
I thought about that.
This is why your dog, licks your face when you come home, because that's how dogs are basically, wolves that never grew up. We've selected for infantile and juvenile characteristics in dogs because it makes them more compatible with human beings.
Wait, so do wolves have the same behavior? Sorry for interrupting you.
Sure. A wolf, goes out. She goes out and hunts, right? She's got some meat. She eats the meat. She comes back to the den. The pups run to the mouth of the den, and then they lick around her muzzle, and that stimulates her to regurgitate the meat that she's ingested. And the pups now have this wonderful meal of partially digested meat that they can eat. Okay, so vomit is not disgusting to dogs because that's how that's how baby wolves get their food. Okay,
I did not know that.
Okay. And so if you I've had dogs for many years. If you have dogs, you're going to be cleaning up dog puke. It's just part of having a dog, okay? And one reason is because they are scavengers as well as hunters, and so they eat a wide variety of things. They're very happy to experiment, and they can tolerate pathogen bearing materials that humans could never tolerate. They can eat roadkill that would make you very ill, and they're fine, right? But when they do vomit, they're not necessarily avoidant of their own vomit, and they may re-ingest it, okay? Because there's this conflict between the system that brings food back to the den and another system which is about disease avoidance. And dogs, by virtue of human domestication, we've just kept them as babies, right? Anyway, so where was I? Oh, food poisoning. If you get food poisoning and you vomit, you're not necessarily disgusted at the time. What will happen is that you will thenceforth be disgusted by that food item, or at least, and this is one of the things that ties back to the ideas about pregnancy. So, both Paul Sherman and Sam Flaxman and myself, we determined through surveying the literature that animal product foods, meat in particular, is the most likely target of gestational aversions, right? And the rationale that we provided for that, and I still have no idea whether there's anything to this or not, I guess, 'cause it's looking more and more like that, like at least the nausea and vomiting are byproducts, and maybe the changes in taste are as well, in preference. But the idea was, look, meat is, a mixed bag. Meat has been crucial to human evolution. It's not now necessary for health. With modern technology, you can live a very healthy life, and probably in most circumstances a healthier life by eating little or no meat. But that wasn't true for most of human evolution, and our entire adaptive complex is built around meat eating. We have guts that are way shorter than you would expect for our body size. And brains that are way bigger and energetically very expensive. Our basal metabolic rate is basically what you would expect for a mammal of our size. So how can we afford this metabolically very expensive brain? And the answer is with a really short gut. This is what's called the expensive tissue hypothesis, first posited by Leslie Aiello. How can you afford a short gut? Well, if the animals that you eat have already done most of the work of turning stuff in the world into the building blocks that you need, then you don't need as efficient a digestive system, right? Gorillas are like cows. They have this big protuberant belly because it's really long digestive tract. They're folivores. They spend all day eating leaves, like cows spend all day eating grass. Right? They have really long digestive tract because leaves are very low in caloric and nutritional content, right? So you have to have this really, really extensive GI tract to extract a lot of nutrition from it. But, we don't. We have a very cheap GI, and that's because we ate things that had already done most of the work for us, okay? So meat, critical in human evolution, a key part, we have a whole, adaptive complex built around meat eating. But it's a mixed bag because, when a plant dies, its chemical defenses against disease continue for a while. It wilts, right? If you harvest the lettuce, it wilts. But animals have active immune systems, and when the animal dies, everything shuts off. So the meat just starts to rot, right away. Okay, meat's a very mixed bag this way, and in both humans and rats are generalists like humans are. They're wide, a fairly broad diet, and they eat meat. In both humans and rats, if we poison you and make you sick, say with chemotherapy, right, or you just got a bad meal at a restaurant, whatever it was, you will preferentially thereafter develop what's called a conditioned taste aversion that lasts about 10 years, and it will target things on the basis of two criteria: either meat, okay, or some other related animal product, or novelty. If you've never eaten that thing before and you ate it now, then it's logical that would be the thing that you would avoid because you can get sick eating all the other stuff, right? Actually, oncologists know this, so that if they're giving a patient chemotherapy, for example, and they know that it's going to provoke nausea and vomiting, they sometimes will have the person eat something really unusual that they have not eaten before and they're not likely to eat again. And then they'll just get this, cost-free conditioned taste aversion, right? Because, to eat some strange spice that's not part of your culture's cuisine, well, it doesn't cost you anything not to like that, right? But, if you're all about burgers and fries, and from now on you're fine with the bun, the lettuce, and the fries, but you can't stand the burger, well, that's going to interrupt your life. Okay.
I guess this is one of the real world applications of your work or research.
But it's not my work. I mean, people already knew this long before I got interested in it.
I mean, scientists like yourself, but
yeah. So anyway, this was in a tangent because you asked about disgust after food poisoning, and the answer is you're not actually disgusted by the food at the time that you're vomiting. It's only once that information gets registered in the library, as it were, that now, okay, that's, no more chicken parmesan or whatever it is, right? I can't stand that thing. But that's different. And why do we start talking about that? That's different than ordinary disgust in the absence of, say, food poisoning, right?
So originally the question was, what do the different types of disgust have to do with each other?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Now that's a long.
We've had two tangents. It's fine. 2 or 3.
Yeah,
actually.
Meta tangents on top of tangents. So to avoid pathogens, you need to protect the oral pathway in particular. You need to protect orifices in general. And in fact, my former student Kevin Haley and I did work showing that people are sort of more disgust sensitive at the interface with the environment, because that's where behavior can make a difference, right? So something, we used a hypothetical organ transplant paradigm. So how gross would it be to have various body parts replaced, right? And the stuff that's inside, people are fine. They're like, I don't know what my spleen does, but if I need a new one, fine, give me a new one. But, a new tongue, hell no, right? Like, I do not want a new tongue, right? New eyeball, new genital opening, new anus, nope, don't want it. Okay, very disgusting, right? Even new skin, right? Because it's at the interface with the environment. And so interface in general, that's what you protect with disgust. That's what you guard.
For some reason, when you said skin, that spiked a disgust reaction in my own brain. So the others didn't really. Strange.
Well,
anyway.
A lot of people say an eye transplant. No, I would, we did nasal passage. We had tongue, anus, genital, can't remember them all. And then we had things like liver and lung and stuff like that. People are fine with internal organ transplants. Yeah, it's all good. But, because the psychology is concentrated at the interface of the body and the environment, right? And the mouth is the principal one, right? Like, a rectal thermometer, okay? Like there's a part of the outside world going inside you, okay? How concerned are you about how, like, the hygienic precautions taken before the rectal thermometer is inserted versus how concerned are you about the hygienic precautions taken for an oral thermometer?
It's strange. I think, there is a big difference. So you understand,
It's the mouth, right? Because this oral tolerance problem, that's how the world gets into you. Is very rarely does stuff get into you through the back door. It's mostly through the front door, right? So the psychology of disgust that is associated with cues of the presence of pathogens is intimately linked to nausea and vomiting. But we were talking about insects, and in particular ectoparasites, right? So creatures that prey on the surface of the body, ticks, fleas, lice, mosquitoes, etc., right? Leeches. Being nauseated or even vomiting does nothing to protect you against a tick, okay? And ectoparasites are a pretty significant selective pressure in all animals, both because it's sort of death by 1,000 nicks, right? That is, they're pulling resources from the host each time you're parasitized, and because they're vectors for disease transmission, right? So there, lots and lots of animals have very sophisticated ectoparasite avoidance and removal mechanisms. So Tom Kupfer at Nottingham Trent and I posited that when people say they're disgusted by ectoparasites, part of what we're getting there is, first of all, the vagaries of the lexical emotion term, right? So languages and cultures carve up subjective experience in different ways. And no one language maps the entire landscape of human emotional experience with discrete lexical labels. Right? So just to give you an example of that, think about how you feel if you see a cute baby or a little puppy. Okay, we don't in English we don't have an emotion term for that. Okay, folks that my wife and I worked with for a number of years on the southwest coast of Sumatra, they have a word which is something like shivers up your spine. Okay, and you can use it in the context of sort of getting the willies when you're in the forest at night, and there's shadows. But you can also use it. Well, it's an aversive experience in that context, but you can also use it to describe how you feel when you see a cute baby, right? It's, the best translation would be something like, I'm getting shivers up my spine because I'm overcome by cuteness, right? And I mean, your listeners, I'm sure people know what I mean, right? Yeah. What is that experience? We just don't have a word for it, okay? And it turns out that not having a word for it means you pay less attention to it and you think about it less and so on, right? Well, so when English speakers say disgust, that is an imprecise term. It's potentially grouping together a bunch of different experiences that are not isomorphic. They may partially overlap for evolutionary reasons that I'll discuss in a minute, but they aren't necessarily the same thing. So when people say, I'm disgusted by ticks or fleas or lice or, leeches, whatever it is, it's not clear that they're actually saying, I experience the same gastrointestinal symptoms that I have if someone, vomits on me, or, I realize I've stepped barefoot in dog feces or something like that. Okay. And the adaptive response to, the presence of ectoparasites is removal. Okay. Get it off me. Okay, not vomit.
But could I ask just one quick question? So getting away from language, do people in those cases, I actually don't know, make this disgust face? You know what I'm talking about, right? Where people...
Yeah. Okay. So we don't actually know the answer to that very well. What we do know, because Kupfer and I have done this work with our colleagues, including a paper that we're about to submit revisions on. We got pretty favorable reviews. I'm optimistic that it'll be published fairly shortly. In which we show in studies of online participants in the United States, a laboratory study at UCLA in California, and an on-the-street study in Shanghai in China, that when you actually ask people more granular questions about things like, does their skin itch? Do they feel, these cutaneous sensations of tickling, and do they want to scratch, for example, okay? Or do they feel nauseated, loss of appetite, feel like gagging or vomiting, right? So what do? We show people videos of, creepy crawler ectoparasites, or things like, overflowing filthy toilets, okay? And what we get is a divergence where people report these cutaneous sensations. They feel an urge to scratch, their skin prickles, right? When they see the ectoparasites, and not when they see, dirty toilets, okay? And it's not that they never report, I feel somewhat nauseated, I feel like gagging, but they do so with less frequency and less extremely, okay? And the converse is true when they're looking at the toilets. Now it's mostly this gastrointestinal stuff, and their skin, they don't feel like scratching when they see a dirty toilet, okay? So the mechanisms are, in fact, adaptively distinct, addressing different adaptive challenges. Does that mean that, it's just an accident of language that we call these things by the same emotion term? No, because there is some overlap between the subjective experiences. And probably what that overlap is revealing is what's called neural reuse. So if you think about it, if all of these different mechanisms that I've described, they're all, different blades in a very fancy Swiss Army knife is the metaphor that, evolutionary psychologists like to use for the human mind. That it's not a computer that has one CPU and that does all the information processing. There are a bunch of specialized mechanisms. Well, each of these mechanisms has to live somewhere in a neural network in the brain, okay? And as you get more and more complex behavior with more and more, sophisticated adaptive mechanisms addressing challenges in the environment, and keep in mind that humans, live in many ecosystems, they have many different forms of social structure and so on, right? I mean, there's a lot of complexity there. There are many, many adaptive challenges that need these specialized, blades in the Swiss Army knife. Well, how do you keep, evolving new mental mechanisms over the course of, not just the last 300,000 years, but the last, call it, 3 million years, right? How do you keep evolving these without just having the brain get, unsupportably large? Okay. And the answer is in part that you can have the same brain bits do different things by connecting them in different ways. And so if you have a mechanism that serves one adaptive function, and there's some features of it that would be useful for another adaptive function, by linking up parts of that network to other neurons, and I'm being intentionally hand-waving here because not just am I ignorant about neuroscience, but I don't think anybody actually knows all the details of this, right? If you do that, then, you can keep sort of, crafting new mechanisms without necessarily needing new real estate, right? And you don't have to keep expanding geographically. You're just reconnecting things that are already there. And Terry Deacon at University of California, Berkeley, who's a neuroscientist, unlike me, he likes to use the word kludge to describe the mind, right? So a kludge is, a jury-rigged solution by combining the existing things that you have on hand, right? You come up with a solution by creatively linking up things. So, when I lecture on this, the slide that I like to show is somebody built a lawnmower bicycle, right? So they've replaced the front wheel with the lower bits of a push mower, and you ride around your lawn. This is a kludge, right? It has advantages in that it's making use of what you have, but it's not necessarily the way an engineer would design the product from the start, right? And it's going to have limitations as a consequence of that. And many aspects of the mind have this kludge-like structure to them, including emotions. When our participants report some levels of gastrointestinal symptoms when they see, ticks or lice, probably what we're getting there is the overlap in neural networks between the disgust that targets pathogens that could be orally ingested, right, and this ectoparasite defense mechanism, because they're just sharing some real estate there, and so the system isn't perfectly optimal because it's not functional to have GI symptoms in the presence of ectoparasites, but it's an intrinsic limitation of a kludge that you're going to get some compromise in perfection this way.
So is there is there some conservation of disgust sensitivity across these different domains then? So for example, if you have someone who's really disgust sensitive to, I don't know, they're very disgust sensitive when it comes to insects, is that person more likely to also be disgust sensitive when it comes to sex? Or
they are. Yeah, they are. Now, one explanation for that is that their particular sets of networks for this emotion are very sensitive, and that is possible. Another explanation that we can't really easily differentiate, and that certainly is compatible with other evidence, as I'll describe for a minute, is that this is somebody who is risk averse, okay? Because essentially these prophylactic mechanisms, whether it's against ectoparasites or pathogens, right, you're paying a cost to avoid a hazard, okay? Individuals will differ in predictable ways in terms of their willingness to take risks or pay costs to avoid hazards, as it were, right? So there are going to be life history differences between individuals as a function of their early childhood environments. Some individuals are on a faster life history trajectory where if they've gotten cues that the world is a dangerous place, then it pays to live fast and die young. and other individuals are going to be on a slower trajectory where if they've gotten cues that the world's a pretty safe place, then it pays to take your time and build a very complicated, organism. And as a consequence, individuals who are on faster life history trajectories should take more risks across the board, right? Including in disease and parasite realms. And individuals who are on slower life history trajectories should be more avoidant. Biological sex is connected to life history. So in a effectively polygynous species like ours, which means that the variance in male reproductive success is greater than the variance in female reproductive success. There are going to be some guys who have many offspring and some guys who have few, whereas the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful woman is going to be much less. And that's because of the obligate investment in reproduction. So pregnancy and lactation are very expensive. And so that means that in mammals, females are the limiting factor in male reproductive success. There's lots of competition by males for access to females because the obligate investment by males, human males can invest a great deal in reproduction for decades, right? Supporting their children, but it's not obligate, right? The obligate investment is very low. I often ask my students what the minimum time span for a woman to reproduce is, right? And they sort of say 9 months, and then they think about it, and I say, well, there's no, there are no, food processors, there's no baby food, what's baby going to eat? And they say, okay, well, she's got to nurse the baby, so I add on a year or so at least, right? And I say, okay, and
it's probably more 15 years or.
Well, in a society that prioritizes slow trajectory, it's like ours. It's going to be a decade and a half to 2 decades. In societies where investment in human capital, as it were, is less important to success, it doesn't need to be that long. Kids can, depending on the ecology, kids can start to become kind of economically self-sustaining. They start being meaningful food producers in sort of middle childhood, 7, 8 years old. This village in Sumatra that my wife and I worked in, boys, by the time that they were 8, 9 years old, they were proficient at fishing, and they'd go out fishing by themselves and often would feed the family for the day, right? So depending on the ecology and the social and cultural environment, it doesn't have to be 15 years before a kid is really kind of self-sustaining, right? But anyway, it's clearly at least a couple of years
longer than men
minimum. And then I ask, well, how long does it take for men? And there's always some smart aleck woman in the back of the lecture hall who goes 30 seconds, right? The obligate investment is just much lower, right? And the consequence of that is that there's greater variance in reproductive success among men than there is among women, which means that there's more competition for access to mates among men than there is among women, which means that men are on a faster life history trajectory than women because taking your time, playing it safe, going slow, and not getting a reproductive opportunity is the same as being dead from the perspective of natural selection. Okay, so as a consequence of all of that, men die sooner than women, even when we take out accidents and violence, which themselves are forms of risk-taking, right?
Do you know if you take men who are, say, 40 years old, and then you compare them to women at 40 years old and look at their life expectancy, does that gap reduce or?
Yeah, so I'm talking about, especially in societies that don't have the privilege of the remarkable medical, facilities that we benefit from, child and in particular infant mortality is much higher. And if you make it out of childhood, so past sort of age 5 on, you have a decent chance in a hunter-gatherer society of living into your 70s, but women still live longer than men do. And in a society like the United States, after you remove accidents and violence from causes of mortality, the longevity gap is still about 6-7 years. Okay, so
that's a long time.
It is, and you go to a retirement home, a senior facility, and you'll find kind of a lot of lonely ladies, right? Because there'll be more women than there are men because of this difference in life history trajectory. The men are investing less in maintenance earlier in life, and so they burn out sooner. And the reason they're investing less in maintenance is because they're investing more in competitiveness. That's what testosterone, builds, competitive male bodies, and comes at the expense of immune function. Okay. Like taking exogenous hormones can be, for non-medical reasons can be very dangerous because, for example, increased cancer risk in, bodybuilders who use steroid hormones. Well, your immune system is normally protecting you against cancer, and it's not doing its job well when you're taking those hormones. So men are on a faster life history trajectory than women. Men take more risks than women. And correspondingly, they take fewer precautions. They go to the doctor less often. They report fewer symptoms when they go to the doctor, etc. Right? It's not just riding motorcycles. Those are all manifestations of the same thing, right? And correspondingly, they are less disgust sensitive on average than women are. Okay, so you asked about correlations between disgust sensitivity across domains of disgust. So ectoparasite versus pathogen versus sexual versus moral and so on, right? And we do find those correlations, but we also find correlations with other aspects of risk versus precaution, right? So it's hard to say how much of it is because of neural reuse and overlap in networks in the disgust systems, that those are all just kind of one thing that are, they're all linked to each other. So if it's high on one dimension, it's high on the other dimensions. And how much of it is because that is part of a basic strategy where you weigh opportunity against precaution, right? And we know even, separate from issues of male versus female, for example, individuals who report taking, and this is work done by my former postdoc, Adam Sparks, and my longtime collaborator, Colin Holbrook, and I, we know that if you ask people about like recreational risk taking, and precautions that they take and so on, individuals who are high on disgust sensitivity are also high on risk avoidance in other domains of life that have nothing to do with disgust, where no one would ever say, that's an emotion that's relevant to that domain, right? And conversely, those who are low on disgust sensitivity take more risks in those areas, right? They take fewer precautions. So it's hard to tease apart those two explanations. One is sort of the whole organism, what's its entire life strategy, and the other is the details of the neural architecture. They could both be contributing, but we do know that there is correlation across domains of disgust. Now, you also asked about sexual disgust and moral disgust. Sexual disgust, and here, for example, there are substantial sex differences between men and women in sexual disgust. That's consistent with the greater female obligate investment in reproduction. That female mammals should be more selective about their partners than male mammals are because they have more at stake in each reproductive event. And sexual disgust is basically the reaction that is telling you this individual is a poor reproductive partner. Okay, that might be because there are indications of low genetic quality. Okay, so they are highly asymmetrical. And those of your viewers who are watching this on YouTube, if you look very closely, you can see that my face is actually quite asymmetrical. My mandible is much longer on one side than the other.
But not disgusting.
Well, I would be even more handsome than I am in my own estimation if I were more symmetrical. Okay, so symmetry is attractive, and you can Photoshop any face to make it more physically attractive by just taking half of it and mirroring it. Symmetry is attractive because it's hard to build a symmetrical organism. So it's a reflection of genetic quality. It's a reflection of the quality of the immune system. Exactly why my mandible is asymmetrical is not entirely clear, right? Whether it was an injury early in life or whether it was an infection or whether it's just, a bad blueprint it is unknown, right? But we find symmetry attractive. Lots of creatures find symmetry attractive, right? The peacock's tail is an advertisement that is revealing the peacock's genetic quality to the peahen, in part because that tail is so expensive to build and maintain. And part of its expense is its symmetry. It's just hard to make something symmetrical in a world full of, insults and injuries and so on. Sexual disgust is in part telling us that individual is a poor reproductive partner because they have cues of low genetic quality, like asymmetry, right? It's all right. My wife loves me for other reasons. Or signs of a weak immune system. Okay. Even something like just lethargy, right? Because when people are sick or parasitized, they have less energy. Okay. Is going to reduce attraction, and strong cues of this being a poor partner will elicit disgust. Okay. That's not the only thing that
disgust there. Do you mean if they're propositioned by one of these men, they will visibly be discussed by the man, or what do you mean?
Right. So here, what we haven't done so far is the kind of extension of the work that I described that Tom Kupfer and I and colleagues are doing, where we're using granular measures of subjective experience, like does your skin prickle, or does your stomach feel upset, right? Those are very fine-grained accounts of subjective experience. We haven't done that for sexual disgust, and I don't think that anybody else has, as far as I know. So exactly what people mean when they say they're sexually disgusted is a little hard to tell, just because I don't think it's been investigated the same way. Although I may be wrong. I have a terrible memory, and the disgust literature is growing by the day. So there could be well-established studies that do that kind of parsing. But if you just ask people, are you disgusted by the prospect of this? Then they'll tell you, as a function of cues of this being a very poor. So you can think about, for example, highly age disparate unions, right? A very old woman and a young man, right? That's just a poor reproductive partner. She's unlikely to conceive, right? But quality isn't the only dimension. Compatibility is an important one, all sexually reproducing organisms have the problem that that reproducing with a closely related individual will reduce fitness, because mutations occur spontaneously. In a relatively long-lived organism like us, you might accumulate a handful of mutations in the course of your own life. Most of those will not be in the germline, that is, they won't be passed on through the gametes, but some of them occasionally will. Now, a dominant mutation, that is a mutation that is always expressed in the phenotype, regardless of what allele is donated by the other parent. Most mutations are going to be detrimental. Mutations, of course, are the raw material for natural selection, right? It's natural selection acting on variation, and mutation is the source of variation. But most mutations are going to be detrimental to fitness, because organisms are complicated machines, and mutations are just random changes. And so, if you take any complicated machine and you take your laptop and you throw it up in the air and let it hit the concrete, well, the chances are it's not going to work better. It's going to work worse, because it's a complicated machine and you just introduced a random change.
I suppose the analogy is better with taking out a transistor or something.
Fine. Okay. Or just tap it with a hammer, maybe. You just do some random change. Just a little bit of, most of the time it's going to work less well. Occasionally, mutations will introduce some improvement, right? And natural selection will, because those individuals will have higher fitness, they will reproduce more. There'll be more copies of that mutation. Natural selection is just the mathematical process whereby that new version will come to dominate the population, right? But most of them will be detrimental. Well, if they're detrimental and they're dominant, meaning that they're expressed regardless of what version of a gene is contributed by the other parent, natural selection will weed out those deleterious mutations rapidly, right? So take an extreme example, which is progeria. So this is a tragic disease in which individuals age and die very rapidly. So they rarely make it out of their teen years. A 16 or 17-year-old with progeria looks like somebody who's in their 80s or 90s. Okay, and so they just they die before reproducing, and that is a novel mutation. You never inherit the gene for progeria because it never gets passed on through reproduction. Okay, that's just an extreme example. But anything that reduces fitness and is a dominant gene, meaning it will be expressed in the phenotype of any individual who carries that can get weeded out by natural selection fairly quickly, okay? And the frequency in the population will be reduced or even eliminated, okay? But mutations which are recessive, that is, which only show up when you, in the phenotype, but they only influence the phenotype when you get two copies, one from each parent, those are like little time bombs because all of us carry deleterious recessive mutations, right? We have inherited them from our forebears, and they don't affect our phenotype, but they're in there in our gametes. And if we mate with an individual who carries the same deleterious recessive mutations, now our offspring will be homozygous, that is, they'll have two copies of that deleterious recessive mutation, in which case it will be phenotypically expressed, in which case fitness will be reduced, okay? So this is going to be true for any sexually reproducing organism, and it's why inbreeding depression happens. That is why mating between individuals who are closely related will result in less fit offspring. So natural selection has produced a wide variety of mechanisms to reduce inbreeding. Some of those are, so in many social mammals, for example, one sex or the other, depending on the species, leaves at sexual maturity. It leaves its group. It immigrates to a new group, okay? As a way of avoiding, functionally, what's going on in the animal's minds, we don't know, right? But functionally, it avoids inbreeding, okay? There are also sophisticated mechanisms that seem to allow individuals to recognize who their offspring are in, for example, white-faced capuchin monkeys in Costa Rica, studied by my UCLA colleague Susan Perry, where a dominant male who monopolizes reproduction in the troop, his tenure as alpha male will be more than one reproductive generation along. That is, his daughters will become reproductive while he's still in charge, and yet he preferentially avoids mating with them. So he knows who his daughters are.
Is that a disgust mechanism or no?
Well, we don't know, because you can't ask the capuchin, okay?
He doesn't do this with his nose,
It's hard to know what exactly the emotional lives of animals are. It's not impossible, but it's difficult, okay? But presumably what is going on is he knows what females he's mated with, and he knows what offspring those females have born. And so through that, the mechanism is identifying his kin. In humans, and this is work, I've done a little bit of work in this area. The person who's done most of the work is my friend and colleague, Deb Lieberman. In humans, there are sophisticated mechanisms that allow us to identify kin on the basis of early experience. And we experience disgust reactions to the prospect of sex with those individuals. Okay, it's not because they're genetically unfit. It's just because they're a poor match because they will carry many of the same deleterious recessive mutations that we carry. And that actually was, if you want to, where do you point the finger at the start of evolutionary psychology? Arguably, the observation that people are averse to sex with those with whom they have grown up, independent of their actual biological relatedness, and that there's an evolved mechanism driving that system. That observation dates to the late 19th century. Edvard Westermark, who was a sociologist only because anthropology as a discipline didn't exist, he observed this in a culture in which there is a preferential first cousin marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and if those cousins grow up together in the same home because they're living on the same farm, then they avoid one another as sexual partners, despite the fact that their elders would like them to marry in order to keep the land from being broken up into different farms over time. And subsequently, similar evidence has been collected among Israeli kibbutzim, so these utopian communities established in Israel, and in which in some of them, to establish gender equality, rather than having women be solely responsible for infant care, children were raised in communal nurseries, so unrelated kids being raised together, and then subsequently averse to sex with one another as adults. It's similarly been demonstrated by Arthur Wolf in studies of a practice in that's not prominent in contemporary Taiwan, but was within recent memory, called Simpua marriage, in which, to avoid high bride price costs, a family with a little boy would adopt a little girl, pay a token bride price, and then raise them as a bride for their son. And those two individuals are, averse to sex with one another. They have, high divorce rates, low fertility rates, and so on, right? Those are kin recognition mechanisms, which, serve functions of identifying individuals with whom we have a nepotistic shared interest, but also serve the function of identifying individuals for sexual avoidance. And disgust seems to play a really important role in that.
What I find really interesting, can I just mention, is
Sure.
I find it really interesting that those same individuals would be more comfortable, for example, sharing food, I imagine, than with strangers. But so there seems to be a disconnect between these two different types of disgust here. So there's an
Absolutely. Example. You love your sibling. You want to help your sibling. In fact, you want to help your sibling even if you don't love your sibling. So even people who say, I'm not so fond of that person, but I'm closely related to them, they're more likely to help that person than they are to help an unrelated individual about whom they feel similarly, right? That is because, our relatives are just another, that is our biological relatives, not our in-laws, are another vehicle whereby our genes get out there in the next generation, okay? So inclusive fitness isn't just the individual's own reproductive output, but the reproductive output of their kin, because their kin share genes with them, okay? So nepotism is universal in the animal world, where when animals are social, right? If they hang around with other members of their species, they will favor, it's true of trees, it's true of all kinds of living things, right? They will favor individuals to whom they're closely related over individuals to whom they are not, because they have a vested interest in their welfare, okay? And something like sharing food, or the sociality problem that I described earlier, that, it's so good to see grandma after lockdown, and, you kill grandma by infecting her with COVID, right? You value that relationship because kin help each other, right? Because they have a vested interest in one another's welfare. So they should want to hang out. They should want to help each other. They should want to share food. They should not want to have sex with each other, right? And the mechanisms are very precise about this, right? People will be overjoyed to be reunited with their close kin. They don't want to see them naked having sex, right? And that actually leads me to the other aspect of disgust, which arguably is the facet of this which is really probably unique to human beings, and that's moral disgust. So both Deb Lieberman and I and Carlos Navarrete have done work showing that that people experience an aversive reaction to others' incestuous behavior, right? Even when it doesn't involve them, as a function of their own childhood with rearing with siblings. Okay, so only children are less disgusted by consensual sibling incest than people who grew up with siblings, right? And we think that what is going on here is that knowing about somebody else's incestuous behavior evokes the possibility of one engaging in such behavior oneself, and that turns on the disgust mechanism that turns off sexual desire. Okay, so just like there's an antithesis between hunger and disgust, there's an antithesis between sexual desire and disgust. And Diana Fleischman, the colleague that I mentioned earlier, and some other colleagues and I have done work measuring physiological measures of sexual arousal to demonstrate this antithesis, right? Things like incest taboos, and I should say incest and inbreeding are not the same. Incest is a cultural phenomenon because cultures define who are appropriate mating partners and who are not. And it's not isomorphic with biological relatedness, as is evident in cases like preferential first cousin marriage that I described before, which biologically is a bad idea, but is actually a quite common cultural preference because it maintains material wealth in a lineage. But taboos, you can think about taboos like that as a manifestation of what we call egocentric empathy, which is, so true empathy is when you feel what someone else is feeling, right? Egocentric empathy is what you feel if you were doing what they're doing. So babies are not disgust sensitive. Probably for adaptive reasons. Okay.
Really? Okay.
Babies will put anything in their mouths, including feces and other things that adults never would. Okay.
You'd think it would be the other way around, right? Because they don't know anything about what they're putting in their mouth, so surely they should avoid poisonous things.
I'll give you a hypothesis for that in just a minute. Elizabeth Abrams and I published work on a conjecture as to why that is, but. Hold on for a minute. Think about how you feel if you see a baby eating poop. Okay, the baby's not disgusted. The baby might be perfectly happy, right? He's having a grand old time eating poop. Okay, or playing in it or whatever. Okay, but you're grossed out by this. Okay, that's egocentric empathy. It's not true empathy. Okay, and so incest taboos may be a consequence of egocentric empathy. That is, even if you the way that we did these experiments, we gave people a vignette in which there's fully consensual sibling incest among adults, right? And if people grew up with a sibling, then they report more disgust, and importantly, they're more punitive towards these characters in the vignette. Okay, they think society needs to do bad things to them because what they're doing is wrong. Okay,
so in China, where they've got the one-child policy, is this visible along this domain or?
I'm not sure I understand the connection. Sorry.
So in China, you had the one-child policy. So you have a whole country full of single children, and so. Oh,
I see what you're asking. So you're saying are people less disgusted by vignettes about consensual sibling incest than somewhere else
at a societal level?
Yeah. The trouble with that is. There's so many other things that vary across cultures, right? I mean, you're not just varying how many families have one child. You're varying a whole bunch of other things simultaneously. Sure. So I mean, it might be an interesting result, but I wouldn't say that it would be, necessarily illuminating because there's so many other things that I mean, there, parenting changed dramatically in China with the single child policy, and there's a lot of concern in contemporary China about indulgent parenting of single children and what's going to happen, what are the personalities of these individuals and so on, right? But okay, back to taboos. The incest taboo from enforcing the incest taboo from the perspective of the individual is not actually functional, right? Who cares what those people do, right? I mean, it doesn't affect your fitness if they're doing that, right?
Except you live in a group, right? This is a disease transmission vector, no?
Yeah, sex is a disease transmission vector.
So that's what I'm saying. So there's no benefit to this pair having sex, but this is a possible way that disease could spread within your in-group.
Okay, so this is an important feature of an important point about how natural selection operates. Natural selection is competition within a population. Okay, so cultural evolution can act to promote the good of the group, right? And so we get the the cultural evolution of norms of self-sacrifice for the good of the group, for example. Throw yourself on the grenade, okay, right? Which is great for the group, bad for you, okay, right? Natural selection by itself does not produce, with the exception of some very special circumstances, it doesn't produce mechanisms that shape behavior in a way that benefit the group at the expense of the individual, okay? Because from the perspective of, which genes become more prominent in the population, everybody else is a competitor. If they don't share your genes, they're just competing for representation in the next generation, okay? So, all else being equal, individuals ought not to care about, from the sort of strict natural selection perspective, about the behavior of in consensual sibling incest, okay, but they do care deeply, and probably what's going on there is that is a byproduct of the inbreeding avoidance mechanism. It's functional for them to care a lot about who their own partners are. It's not functional strictly from the perspective of that kind of simple natural selection. So, but what's going on is, of course, humans are moral creatures, okay? That is, we have elaborate rules governing behavior in a wide variety of domains, including, but by no means limited to, the sexual domain, right? And those rules are largely, but not exclusively, culturally evolved. There's some biological evolution in terms of the rules about, fair exchange, for example, right? So, in individual dyadic reciprocity and so on. But what seems to have happened is that that there's been a coevolution of our species' dependence on culture as a way not just of having technology that allows us to cope with the environment, but that structures our social interactions, like sharing food among hunter-gatherers, as I described before. That's a cultural rule, okay? That, is universal across hunter-gatherer groups, because you can't make a living without that rule, basically. So groups that don't have that elaborate conceptual architecture don't make it, right? Okay. Well, if you're a cultural organism, that is, if you're a species that is going to be born into a world in which cultural information from members of your group, is really important to knowing how to succeed. What animals are dangerous? What foods can you eat? How do you make tools? What constitutes various forms of cooperation, etc., right? All of these things, this is all cultural information. So there have to be a whole bunch of blades in the Swiss Army knife that are dedicated to the acquisition, retention, transmission, use of cultural information, right? And we have this in spades as humans, right? So one easy example is what's called prestige bias transmission, right? So we tend to imitate whole hog successful individuals, which is why sports stars and celebrities can sell you products that have nothing to do with their actual success, right? They can sell you life insurance and watches, and that's not why that guy is good at hitting that little white ball in a little hole in the grass, right? Has the kind of underwear that he wears has nothing to do with how high he can jump up to the basketball hoop, right? But they can sell us those products because we, in the world of our ancestors, it was hard to tell what led to someone's success, so we just adopted whole hog many of their practices. That's a special blade in our Swiss Army knife, okay? Well, if you're going to have, complex social interaction, that interaction is most effective when it is governed by a bunch of rules, right? At the simple level, the rules are just coordination, right? Which side of the road do you drive on, right? See, in the pre-pandemic days, if you went to a badly designed international airport, there were always pedestrian traffic jams because there was no consensus as to which side of the hallway you're supposed to walk on, right? People who came from countries where people drive on the right walked on the right, and people who came from countries where they drive on the left walked on the left. And if they're going opposite directions, that means they run into each other, right? Okay. They're just coordination rules, okay? But that's just a simple example. Obviously, they're in terms of the problem of cooperation and cheating, right? The problem of how to regulate antisocial, self-interested behavior in general, right? That's where we say that's the domain of morality, which is just we're carving off a special part of cultural rules and calling it that thing, right? Well, there should be a bunch of blades in our Swiss Army knife that are dedicated not just to acquiring all kinds of cultural information, but to acquiring moral rules in particular, because one of the things that we as humans do is we don't just punish those who inflict costs on us. We punish those who violate rules even when it doesn't affect us. And we have what's called higher order punishment, which is we punish people who fail to punish people who do bad things. And once you have higher order punishment, the costs of punishment go way down, okay? Because you don't have to punish people very often, because most people will engage. If someone does do something wrong, most people will shun them. Most people will, because you don't want to be the guy who, this pedophile moved in next door to me after he was released from prison. I don't care. You don't want to be that neighbor, right? Because people are going to say, oh, you think pedophilia is okay, do you? Okay, well, now we're going to shun you too. Okay, so we have these systems of punishment, which means that we should have an elaborate psychological architecture for the acquisition of moral rules, where we experience the violation of moral rules as if it were transgressions against ourselves. We are outraged, even though it doesn't involve us at all, okay? And we're willing to pay costs to punish individuals who break those rules, okay? Disgust, there are many kinds of emotional reactions to moral violations that don't involve disgust, okay? They mostly involve anger, which is, the simple response to transgression. Someone punches you, you're mad, okay? Someone cheats you, you're mad. We treat violations of rules of moral rules as if they were transgressions against the self. But some of the domains of morality contact disgust. So rules about food, rules about sex, okay? And then moral disgust is basically just leveraging that existing architecture that is there for these other purposes as part of the psychology of a culture-dependent species, right? That is, as part of the way of motivating punishment of rule violators. And disgust is actually a pretty cheap pathway for punishment, because it just motivates avoidance, right? It's dangerous to go up to a rule violator and get in their face. They might hit you, right? But just say, I don't want to be near that person. I don't want to be associated with them, right? That's cheaper for you as a punisher, right? And so disgust is available as a pathway that cultural evolution can leverage emotions to motivate punishment. And probably the entry points are things like the sexual domain and the food domain. So we get food taboos, we get sexual taboos, and so on, right? But it's not limited to those. You can be disgusted by,
betrayal,
embezzlement. Yeah.
I see.
Now, how much of that is?
Could I just so I make sure I understand? So, for example, so you're saying there's a link between disgust and morality, but it's not one-to-one. So, for example, I'm not going to be disgusted that someone robbed a bank, but then there are various domains within morality which are sort of governed by this disgust emotion. So
I would say that the evolved psychology of disgusts, plural, right? These multiple things that we're all using the same English word for, right? Presents affordances, opportunities for cultural evolution where it's easier to motivate punishment in those domains by using disgust. But, we're a culture-dependent species, so, the capacity is there to attach strong emotions to a wide variety of things. So you might say, well, I wasn't disgusted by the bank robbery until I learned that, the people whose savings were taken were all, elderly, or people from a disadvantaged background, or they were physically handicapped in some fashion, right? That is, they were extremely vulnerable. And now I start to be not just angry, but disgusted as well, okay? That which, by the way, different cultures have different moral systems. The cultures of the sort of, the North Atlantic, as it were, prioritize harm as one of the principal moral violations, as opposed to purity, okay? So harm, like, these innocents have been, if, this huge banking organization, they got tons of assets, they're kind of an exploitative institution anyway, I don't care if they got robbed. But now if I know that these these innocents were harmed. Okay, now I care if I'm from a culture that places a high priority on protecting others from harm. But there are cultures that place a high priority on purity. Okay, the cultures of South Asia, for example, is one whole culture region that places a high priority on purity. And now it may have more to do with contamination, okay, with prohibited social interactions, exchanges, and so on, right? Failure to perform adequate ritual purification, etc., rather than harm.
Could I ask a question just quickly? One part of the story that you're telling at the moment that I don't really, which I'm not grasping, is so what precedes what? Is it morality that precedes disgust, or is it disgust that precedes morality, or is it a combination of the two that depends on the type of disgust that you're talking about? And that's something I'm not following exactly.
So it depends what you mean by proceed. If you mean in individual development, and we're going to get back to babies and poop in a minute.
Please.
If you mean, who doesn't like talking about poop? If you mean individual development, then it's probably the case that some of the kind of primordial components of disgust, like distaste, right? So babies and small children don't like bitter tastes because bitter tastes index the presence of plant toxins, and they can't handle the plant toxins, so they don't want to eat the bitter vegetables and so on, right? Those things are there fairly early on, and then as children, start to acquire an understanding of their culture's moral systems, they're also starting to acquire they're starting, not acquire, but they're starting to mature other forms of disgust. So those things are kind of happening, they're co-occurring. If you mean, over evolutionary time, there were, there were pre-cultural primates, right? So lots of social primates seem to have something like a kind of rudimentary aspect of culture. There are traditions that are passed down in communities, things like nut cracking in chimpanzees and so on, right? Where they're, in the same ecosystem, one group of chimpanzees will do it and another group won't do it, or won't do it anywhere near as frequently, or won't do it the same way, and things like that. So that's a kind of culture, but it's a pretty rudimentary culture, right? Well, the problems of disease avoidance, they're as old as life itself, because as soon as they're living things, they're pathogens that evolve to exploit them, right? So, if we had to push into way deep time, I would say some of these really simple forms of disgust must predate other things. But then, it's not like there were species without culture and then there were species with culture, right? That's not the way evolution works, right? There's this gradual process in which, as socially transmitted information becomes more important, biological evolution selection will increasingly favor psychological architecture that allows individuals to acquire and exploit that information and to succeed in a group that is governed by that information. So there is a coevolution between an increasingly rich cultural repertoire of information in a species and an increasingly elaborate set of mechanisms for the acquisition and use of that cultural information. And so now if you ask me what comes first, in disgust and morality, well, now it's all tangled up, right? We have to push back into a kind of pre-cultural time where we can see things like, avoiding suboptimal mating partners and avoiding the presence of disease. Those are problems that don't have to have a cultural component to them, right? They just have to have some rudimentary sociality to them. But once we start the ball rolling, then these coevolutionary interactions between cultural evolution and biological evolution will happen, and you can't tease them apart. Are we ready for babies and poop now?
Please.
Okay. So why do babies eat poop? And not just poop, but the key feature about infant mouthing behavior, and this is a hypothesis that Elizabeth Abrams and I published. I would not say, it is consistent with known observations. I would not say it has ever been put to a rigorous empirical test, but it's the best explanation that I know of. The important thing about infant mouthing is not just that infants are indiscriminate about what they mouth, but it's that they're avid about it. So anybody who's been around, an infant that can crawl, for example, you got to really watch them, because if there's anything that will fit in their mouth, they'll zoom across the room and grab it and stick it in their mouths, right? I mean, this is why, you can't have marbles and pennies and things like that around, because your kid will die because they'll choke on it, because they'll just put it in their mouth, okay? So that it isn't just that they're sort of blind to possibilities, and so they just do random stuff. They really want to put stuff in their mouths, okay? That makes it look like this behavior must be functional, right? Mm-hmm. Because time and energy are being used to do something that puts babies at risk, okay? Now, if you crack open a developmental psychology book, you'll find these almost laughable explanations like, well, this is how infants explore the world, okay? Which is an idea that, kind of has its origins in Freud and this fixation on the breast. And from the very beginning, that's like a non-starter as an explanation, because, infants very soon after birth can detect the nipple, okay? They don't just mouth indiscriminately on the mother's body. They learn to home in very quickly on this thing, okay, that is, important for their sustenance, right? So they're discriminating from the beginning. And the idea that this is how they explore the environment, look, their eyes work, their hands work, their ears work. Adults don't, run around sticking stuff in their mouths all the time, right? So if there are serious costs associated with this, and of course there are, in addition to choking, there's a serious risk of poisoning, and that's not just the presence of, bleach in your laundry room. It's, toxic plants in the environment. And then, of course, there's disease risk, right? Mm-hmm. So, look, why would natural selection create a system where you information gather in a way that is very likely to kill you without adult intervention, right? There's no evidence to support this, and it's completely implausible, okay? So what is the explanation? Well, Betsy Abrams and I argue that the key lies in understanding the timing of avid mouthing. And that if we look at studies that have been conducted, for example, in trying to gauge the safety of various consumer products and things like that, you want to know what demographics are at risk. Okay, who's likely to put stuff in their mouth? So you basically watch a lot of babies and see when they're avid mouthers. And the answer is they're avid mouthers during the time period when in pre-industrial populations, particularly hunter-gatherer populations, infants would have been breastfed, okay, because their digestive tract is not yet sufficiently mature. Their masticatory abilities and so on are too limited to allow for much other than breast milk, and breast milk, really important in human development. Among all the other things that breast milk has in it, breast milk has maternal antibodies that are transmitted from mother to infant. And although it's not entirely clear the extent to which this is true, there is at least the possibility that those maternal antibodies are functional. That is, that they are providing a temporary umbrella to the infant that gives some of the benefits of the mother's immune system's lifelong experience to date, right? Because she's transmitting some of these antibodies to her baby. So the costs of mouthing in terms of disease transmission are going to be reduced in a nursing infant, conceivably, right? I lots of asterisks and caveats here because this is conjecture. Well, what benefits might occur by mouthing stuff? One important benefit is gauging the pathogen ecology into which one has been born. So humans live in very, very different environments, and they always have, as I said. And both the density of different pathogen species and the composition of that pathogen ecology is going to differ across those larger physical ecologies. And that's going to matter because it's going to affect how much you should be investing in your immune function as opposed to other things that you might invest in, like growth, for example. Okay, in a high pathogen environment, it's more important to invest in your immune system proportionately compared to a low pathogen environment. What's more, exposure to pathogens seems to be really important in calibrating our immune systems. We have co-evolved with pathogens and parasites as well. There's some evidence that you get dysregulation of the immune system if you have inadequate exposure to pathogens early in life. Okay?
In both directions?
You get an overactive immune system that fails to adequately discriminate because it's just badly calibrated. Okay. This was originally called the hygiene hypothesis in the 1980s. It's subsequently been modified to be described as the old friends hypothesis. That is, that there are other living things, microbes and parasites, things like helminths, gastrointestinal worms, which we have co-evolved with. It's not that parasitic worms are our friends, but it is that we have been unable to get rid of them. So in this village that my wife and I worked in, I would treat kids for worms all the time. If a kid got malaria, body temperature went up, worms would come out their nose because the worms are making a run for it. They don't like the high temperatures.
Really?
Okay. Yeah. So, we would deworm kids, but they just get the worms again. Okay. Because they're ubiquitous in the environment. Okay. If you don't have, a really built environment, like is true of the global, much of the global north, it's very hard to avoid them. Okay. And so certainly the evidence with regard to helminths is pretty good that our immune system it is co-evolved with these creatures that are just sort of endemic to our species, essentially. And in fact, helminths have been used experimentally, therapeutically, to treat some conditions that are a consequence of immune dysregulation. And I'm intentionally being vague here because I don't want anybody listening or watching this to go, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go eat some dirt because, I got this.
Pregnant women do this, right? Occasionally.
So that, geophagy does occur, which is the eating of dirt. How much this is adaptive in itself, or how much this is a misfiring of a system, is hard to say. So pregnant women eat a lot of things that are not edible. The medical term for this is pica. And it's not that they should, it's that they do so often. They experience shame. They may not tell their doctors about it. They eat all kinds of strange things, chalk, laundry detergent, things that are really bad for you, cigarette butts. One possible explanation for all of this is that the geophagy is adaptive and the pica is a misfiring of the geophagy system. And what's adaptive in the geophagy is not ingesting pathogens and parasites in the soil, because people are actually selective about the kind of soil that they eat. It's that they're ingesting high calcium content soil, clays that have a lot of calcium, because clay has a very high surface area, calcium, has a very high surface area proportionate to its volume. And as a consequence, it binds with a lot of things. And so it can bind to toxins produced by bacteria, for example. Kaopectate, the medication that's used to treat, nausea and diarrhea, it's basically liquid clay is all it is. And in fact, viewers who take calcium supplements or use antacids to manage heartburn or something like that, they need to be careful, because you don't want to take that in conjunction with any medication, or if you're taking other supplements, because it will neutralize the effects of that. Yeah. So if you're taking like a thyroid replacement hormone for hypothyroidism, very common disease in the global north. You don't want to take your thyroid replacement hormone. You certainly don't want to take it. You shouldn't take it with any food, because food will just, other stuff in your stomach will diminish absorption. But you really don't want to take it with calcium. If you're, a woman who's trying to protect against osteoporosis and is hypothyroidism is more common in women than it is in men, as all autoimmune diseases are. Nearly all. She might be taking calcium supplements. Good thing to do. She might be taking, a thyroid replacement hormone. Good thing to do. Don't take them together. Very bad thing to do. Okay. Or elderly patients who are taking calcium supplements to avoid, senescent osteoporosis. And taking, like blood pressure medication or something like that. Don't take them together, okay? So geophagy in pregnancy might be adaptive, and in cultures where geophagy is normative, it's often used to treat, gastrointestinal distress, basically. And it's not that people are just picking up a handful of dirt and gobbling it down. It's that they are selective about what they're eating, and they're preferentially targeting high calcium content soils. Potentially adaptively. And it turns out that some primates do the same thing when they have, some GI infection. And pica, the cigarette butts and detergent and things like that, that might just be a misfiring of a system that's actually there to target.
It looks like calcium, or it looks like...
Yeah, right. It has some sensory facets, right? So it's texture, or it's color, or something like that it resembles this. So it just gets triggered accidentally, right? But that's not what babies are doing. Okay, babies are not. They're indiscriminate. Okay, and they're avid. So they're not engaging in geophagy. That's for sure. Okay, but what they might be doing is training up their immune systems while they have the protection of mother's milk. Okay, and as I said, there's evidence that individuals who grow up in too clean environments, so if you grow up in the city, you're more likely to have allergies, atopic dermatitis, things like this, asthma, than if you grow up in the country, because the country is dirtier than the city. If you grow up with dogs, you're less likely to have those problems because dogs are dirty, okay, versus, say, cats, okay. If you grow up with, many siblings close in age, you're less likely to have those problems because those siblings bring dirt and, pathogens into your household, right?
Delightful.
Yes. Well, the term in this community where we worked for toddlers, one way of describing a toddler is to call them little snotties, because toddlers just kind of have perpetual rhinovirus infections, right? They're constantly acquiring these, this is true. Any parent of a preschooler will tell you this, is that little kids are just vectors for disease. They're just bringing the bugs home, right? So if you're getting exposed to these during development, then I wouldn't say that the evidence is definitive, but there is, some evidence suggesting that your immune system develops more successfully. It is more properly regulated, and potentially your investment in your immune system is more appropriate to your local ecosystem. So, look, little babies are at risk of, disease by putting stuff in their mouths. Mother's milk helps with that. They're also at risk of, plant toxins and choking. But realistically, if you have an unattended little baby in the world of our ancestors, that baby's not, because little babies are just lion Lunchables, right? I mean, they're just they're little meat packets waiting to be taken by a predator. So, adults have to be attentive, or older siblings, this is often the case, have to be attentive to the actions of, small, crawling humans. And so they can, keep an eye on, no, don't put the poisonous plant in your mouth, right? And by mouthing a whole bunch of other stuff that, let them mouth that, whatever, fine, who cares, right? If the kid isn't obviously going to be poisoned or choke on the thing, then, potentially there's benefit in doing so, right? I mean, when my grandson was little, like the way that he would greet our dogs is just to like walk up to this thing that's like the size of a horse and just put his mouth on it, right? Just like, I mean, just kind of not walk. Walk would be he would lift himself up and go By the time they walk, they're largely not mouthing very much anymore. You still have to be careful about things like dangerous chemicals that look like they might be candy and things like that. I mean, I don't know what the hell the laundry and dishwasher people were thinking when they made these pods that
they do look delicious.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like they're bright colors, they're shiny, right? I mean, it's is poorly thought out product safety, but so like a toddler will stick stuff like that in their mouths, right? A 5-year-old, you got to watch because they'll poison themselves with things like that. But they're not racing around, aggressively picking up everything and putting it in their mouths the way the little crawlers are. Is that explanation right? Don't know. I would be thrilled if one of your listeners, either is a current scientist or a future scientist, go and test it. Prove me wrong. That's fine. That's how science works. Go do it.
Can I ask, if we go back a little bit, so one thing that you mentioned was that men and women have different disgust sensitivity in general.
On average, the distributions overlap, but the same is true for any sex-specific characteristic that the distributions overlap.
Well, so I wanted to. Okay, so I did want to ask how much they differ, but one specific thing that I'm interested in is, there's this risk hypothesis that risk relates to disgust that we've been talking about. One thing I'm wondering about is, so as women age, they go through menopause. So I'm wondering if towards, as they close in on menopause, does their sexual disgust sensitivity go down? Because, if you're breeding with people who you might get diseases from, or early on in your birthing career, then you might jeopardize later chances as well to sire healthy children. Whereas towards the end of your, fertile years, you're not risking, the risk of is not sort of propagated down the line. So is there something like this sort of a mechanism that's going on?
So I don't know the answer. We conceivably have the data in existing data sets that we could address it, but I don't know the answer offhand. I'm not sure if anybody does. There's some things that disgust towards dead things and the possibility of death declines with age, which doesn't entirely match the risk-taking explanation. The risk-taking explanation is by no means, it's explaining a portion of the variance, but not a huge portion of the variance. So it's not the whole picture at all. The thing about sexual disgust, and the reason that your logical conjecture is maybe not as apt as it might seem, is that sexual disgust, the way it seems to work is that we don't experience it absent the possibility of sex. So, you might be, well, not you might be, I'm confident that you, as a reasonable and mentally healthy individual, absent the problems of SARS-CoV-2 transmission, you're perfectly happy riding in an elevator with elderly women, okay? You might not be so happy about those elderly women, being naked and masturbating or something like that, okay?
That would be less pleasant.
You don't experience aversion to those individuals absent the immediate cues that bring the possibility of sex online. And that is really adaptive, okay? And it's not just because you want to be able to interact with, wise elderly members of your community. Think back to what I said about nepotism, right? I mean, the people you want to help the most are the ones you're most closely related to. This is not a moral prescription, by the way. I should have said this at the very beginning. If viewers have gotten to whatever hour we are in this particular, dialogue here, I should have said this at the very beginning, which is don't commit the naturalistic fallacy, right? The naturalistic fallacy is the mistaken idea that, biological explanation, right? This provides some kind of a moral prescription, right? You know, we decide as thinking beings what we think is right and wrong in the world. Scientific explanations for why people do things are irrelevant to whether something is right or wrong. Okay. And that's really important because humans do all kinds of things that we would universally find morally reprehensible, like, you know, rape and murder, war.
And then we do other things that are nice, like adoption, which don't really make genetic sense, I suppose. Right.
So, you know, we make our own decisions as moral agents independent of explanations for why people do things. Okay. So that's really important. Now, backing up, you know, so when I say, you know, the person you should be nice to is your sibling, that's from the perspective of natural selection. That's not a moral prescription. As a moral prescription, I think you should be nice to everyone, right? With the exception of punishment of wrongdoers, right? And forgiveness should be part of that, right? So that when I say should be, I'm saying from the perspective of how natural selection operates. So nepotism being natural doesn't mean it's right. But we can understand exactly why nepotism, the biological, in evolutionary biology, the term is kin selection, which is just, you know, evolution that favors preferential treatment of kin. That's all it is. You can't have, you know, disgust motivating inbreeding avoidance, or anything motivating inbreeding avoidance for that matter, if it's going to interfere with your nepotistic orientation towards kin. Okay. And that's exactly how sexual disgust works, right? So, in fact, it's the way that disgust works in general, which is that we are social creatures and we're very happy being around others as long as we don't see the sides of them that would elicit disgust in us. Okay. So it's great to be around your kin. You just don't want to be around them when they're having sex. Okay. You know, hopefully, you know, all the viewers have, you know, defecated within the last 24 hours, maybe 48 on the outside, right? If there's not, you know, add some fiber to your diet.
Where's this going?
It doesn't. Well, the point is, you'd be perfectly happy interacting with any of those people. You just don't want to be around them when they're taking a dump. Okay. Right. That is, you can interact constructively, productively, pro-socially with others and still have them be potential disgust elicitors as long as you're not exposed to the facet of themselves that is the disgust relevant feature, right?
What about homosexuality then? So morally, you know, if you go back even 20 years, 10 years, people would say it's disgusting that there's homosexuality, right? So where does that line up with, say, pedophilia? And I'm not relating these at all. I'm just from the question of disgust as a scientific topic. How do these line up?
Well, first of all, I need to put an asterisk on your statement that people would find. Okay, if what you mean is the prevailing cultural view in the, you know, the countries of the North Atlantic, then yes, that's true. But there's enormous variation across cultures in terms of how same-sex sexual contact is viewed, and even what people describe as sexual orientation. That is, what constitutes homosexuality. This is enormously variable. So, for example, you know, in many of the countries of Latin America, men having sex with men doesn't define a man as being gay. What defines him as being gay is the role that he plays in that sexual behavior. So the penetrator may be seen as masculine and heterosexual. The penetratee may be seen as gay. Okay, these are cultural constructions that are being built around, you know, various facets of human behavior. Okay, and I should say there's, you know, a reasonable. There's good evidence that there is a heritable component to sexual orientation, and there's a reasonable argument to be made that most humans in any population on the planet have actually more flexible sexuality than cultural norms would lead you to believe. That the default is not exclusive heterosexuality. My Disgust collaborator whom I mentioned earlier, Diana Fleischman, and I have a paper on this where we've got some experimental evidence to support this idea. Lots and lots of social mammals engage in same-sex sexual contact for a variety of functional reasons. Expressions of dominance, right? So if you've been around dogs, you've seen dog fights happen when one dog mounts another dog, and that's a claim of dominance, and now they're going to fight it out to see who's really dominant, right? Lots of mammals use same-sex sexual contact as a form of bonding, the building of close social relationships. If you have a dog who's a leg humper, you've witnessed this as well. Okay,
it's
right?
bonding.
It's bonding. Yes. I love it when people say, "Oh, he's just saying hello." It's a pretty interesting way of saying hello. So it would be bizarre if humans didn't have the same evolved, proclivities and capacities to use sexuality for a variety of social purposes, and those social purposes exceed reproduction and therefore are not limited to opposite sex sexual behavior, right?
So do you suspect then that disgust towards homosexuality is a misfiring, or it's culturally?
I think it's cultural evolution is all that we're seeing there. Okay, so the sexuality and marriage, which are not the same thing, of course, right? But these are domains where cultural evolution is really, really active, right? So every known culture has a concept of marriage and has rules about who can have sex with whom, okay? Those concepts may be quite variable from society to society, and those rules may be quite variable similarly, but that is a human universal, okay? And it's because establishing the guidelines within which these behaviors take place is crucial to the stability of societies, in part because of what I said earlier about effectively polygynous, our species being an effectively polygynous one, right? Men are about 10 to 15% bigger than women on average. They're more muscular, all of that. Those are the signs of a species in which male-male competition has evolved, okay? If you just let male-male competition run wild, you have chaos, okay? You can't get effective cooperation, not just coordination, but cooperation among individuals. And cooperation is crucial to our species, right? That's how we, succeeded as hunter-gatherers, as I said earlier, right? So the snowballing process of biological and cultural evolution that I described earlier is a process in which there arise rules regulating potentially highly disruptive domains. And sexuality is one of those, the prime targets for that, okay? Well, how do you regulate it? You attach strong emotions. You have rules about punishment, okay? Now we're in the domain of morality, right? And in particular, if you have a small society that is surrounded by hostile or potentially hostile rivals, then population growth is going to be one of the important determinants of success. So cultural evolution will favor pronatalism, that is, the promotion of large family size in those circumstances. And that is basically the ancient Hebrews, okay? That is the religion of the ancient Hebrews. Importantly, the moral prescriptions and proscriptions that are in there are about promoting population growth in a world surrounded by competitor societies. Okay, and homosexuality isn't going to result in reproduction. Okay, so one way of encouraging population growth is to say, this is a prohibited behavior. And that legacy, ramifies down into the present day in the societies that are heirs to, the cultures of Christianity of Western Europe, which itself was built on, the cultures of the ancient Hebrews. And so today, the societies in the world that are the most repressive and, from my perspective, the most egregiously violating basic human rights with regard to sexual behavior, and homosexuality in particular, are those post-colonial societies of Africa, where this set of moral rules was imported as part of the colonial hegemony. So what we're seeing there is not anything intrinsic about sexual behavior and a connection to disgust, although disgust operates in the sexual domain. It's cultural evolution exploiting that affordance in the service of pronatalism.
Okay? I see. So in terms of sex and disgust, then is okay. So we discussed discuss modulating attraction, but can you go in the other direction? So can you turn off disgust?
Yeah, sure. That's what sexual arousal does, right?
Okay. So,
I mean,
okay.
Because if bodily fluids are one of the principal avenues for disease transmission, and even more so in a world without epidemic respiratory viruses, which is a speculation on my part, but I don't think there's any question that bodily fluids are an avenue for disease transmission. There's no ambiguity about that, including sexually transmitted diseases, which are as old as our species. Lots and lots of mammals have sexually transmitted diseases, but not unique to sexually transmitted diseases. So vomit, feces, urine, blood, those are all potential pathways for transmission. Sexual behavior would be impossible if you didn't turn off the disgust responses, right? Because it's wet and gushy, okay? It involves the exchange of fluids. That's what it is, right? So all of the sensory cues, texture, odor, noise, right, which ordinarily would be disgust evoking, are neutral or even positive in the context of sexual arousal. So there's an antithesis between these two things. And someone who has, just like someone who's gone without eating for a long time, someone who experiences sexual desire but has not had outlets for that sexual desire for a long time, may be indifferent to a variety of stimuli that in a more sexually sated individual might be aversive.
I see. I guess one line that I'm getting from you is that disgust is way more complicated than just you might say that disgust might lead to racism, say, but on the other hand, these days people say that racism is a disgusting position to hold, right? So and then at the same time, disgust modulates your hunger modulates disgust, arousal works in both directions as well. So it seems that there's no disgust really isn't like a negative or a positive emotion. It's a tool that our bodies use, I suppose, to regulate behavior, and that can be for very positive or very negative on the other hand.
It depends what you mean by negative and positive. If by that you mean from the perspective of the moral observer, then the same is true for not just for disgust, but for many, many features of the human mind, right? That the same things can lead to remarkably virtuous behavior that we would laud, and despicable behavior that we would deprecate, right? Depending on how they're deployed and the meanings that are attached to them. If by positive and negative you mean something like the subjective experience, whether it's aversive or rewarding, disgust is actually interesting in that way too, in that mild disgust is rewarding, high disgust is aversive. And that, I think, this is another conjecture, is part of an adaptive design for information gathering, because if what is sometimes called core disgust, which is the avoidance of pathogens, principally through the oral pathway, the things that the cues that indicate the presence of a risk of disease transmission, those are passive cues, right? So a bear might jump up from behind, a tree and attack you, but the bear's feces isn't going to, okay? It's just a passive threat sitting there, okay? So that means that the kind of prototypical core disgust elicitors are amenable to information gathering to find out what's going on because they're passive, they're not active. And so think about, like flying on a plane in the before times, right? And someone gets airsick, 2 rows back or something, and you hear the sounds of vomiting. If you look around, what you'll see is a whole bunch of people turning and looking at that, right? And this is because as long as you're not actually, being splattered by the vomit, it's important to know what is going on, right? Did that person eat something? What did they eat, right? Are there visible signs of illness other than the vomiting? What's going on here? Okay. So people find mild disgust intriguing. In fact, there was a show called Fear Factor on American television for a while that really wasn't about fear. It should have been called Disgust Factor because it was mostly about who can do the most disgusting things in a competition. Right?
Were you an avid watcher, or?
I would say I was. It was a source of interesting anecdotal evidence. Let me put it that way. Right? Okay, and in like American fraternities at universities repeatedly reinvent this bizarre thing where they have goldfish swallowing competitions where they these risk-prone young men demonstrate their indifference to potential harm by doing disgusting things. Okay, well, why do people watch that? In part because you're learning something about that young man's formidability. Somebody who's risk-prone is a good ally and a dangerous enemy. But in part because this disgust component just is information gathering. Okay, I want to know what's going on. What's going on here? Okay, so disgusting things are intriguing at a low level, not at a high level. At a high level, now it's, whoa, I'm getting splattered, right? Or there's a serious risk of my getting splattered. Now I want to get away from this thing as fast as I can. Okay, so does that mean disgust is a positive emotion or a negative emotion in the subjective, phenomenological sense? Depends on the level of disgust arousal.
I guess the reason why I'm asking this is because, people talk about, from a political standpoint, people say that people of certain political orientations are more disgust sensitive and this sort of thing. And then there's some negative judgment they might put across. So I'm wondering, well, this is sort of getting ahead of us, but is it true that conservatives are more disgust sensitive?
It is, yeah, but they're also more sensitive to threats in general, and there's and we have actually new work that we're just submitting now in the context of the pandemic that addresses this issue actually, and that in part replicates some of these previous results with regard to disgust and so on, right? And that's that, and the logic is, which is a very sound logic, and I should say we shouldn't take liberal as the comparison, the reference group, right? That is like, it's not that the liberals are normal and the conservatives are diseased or something, we have some pathology. It's that there is no optimum with regard to the strategies that I'm going to describe that is constant over evolutionary time, over cultural and ecological change. Okay, so what are the strategies? And this is a theme that I've touched on before, which is how much do you see opportunities in the world? Oh shoot. That is telling me that I have, this has gone way past what I expected it to go past. Sorry, you're going to have to edit.
My apologies.
I have a 1:30 appointment, and it's telling me that I have a 1:30 appointment. So I'm going to have to wrap pretty soon, or we're going to have to continue. But it's an important one. I can't blow this person
Well,
off.
how about we do the following thing? How about I just fast forward to one more question that's very quick to answer, and maybe who knows? Maybe in the future we can talk another time. But would that
we
work?
can. The political orientation one. It's an important one. I can try and do it fast now if you want, and then you can maybe edit this little bit in here, or we can skip to something else. It's up to you.
Sure. And then I'll ask just one like very quick question. What is the time? Is it 1:30 that you need to run away now?
I have 13 minutes.
Okay. Well, let me ask the very, very quick question.
Okay.
With all of everything you've learned, so this is the silly question that I wanted to ask to end on like a happy point. But how do we get people to eat insects?
Okay, it's an important point. By the way, I think all of this is happy from my perspective because it's just fascinating how remarkable human beings are and how much the things that we experience all the time we take for granted. And if you approach them with a scientific mindset and say, why do these things happen? It's fascinating to understand the complexity of human beings and the presence of the legacies of our evolutionary history. I think this is fascinating, and it's also happy because knowledge is power. If you know why people react the way that they react, if you know why you yourself react the way that you react, then you have greater agency to make choices about what you think is appropriate in your own life and how you're going to view different aspects of human behavior. So it's all happy as far as I'm concerned. But I agree with you that getting people to eat insects may save the planet because meat consumption, which is happier than just intellectual curiosity or even individual agency, because meat consumption is a significant contributor to global warming, the production of meat. Not the consumption, but the demand that creates that production, and is growing as economies around the world develop. Consumer demand only increases, and it's just not sustainable. So we need other sources that can substitute for meat, and plant-based proteins can do that, but they require considerable engineering to have the taste and texture properties that people find rewarding in meat. There's some good products out there, but it requires considerable engineering, and that in itself is energy intensive, and so that is part of the solution, but not the sole solution. Insects can be raised in an ecologically sustainable fashion. Very little acreage, very little energy input, and can actually be very little nutritional input cost because they can be raised on what are otherwise waste products from other aspects of food production and so on, right? So insects definitely an important thing, and in many, many cultures, insects are an important food source and are a highly valued one. Okay, so when we say people find insects disgusting, we're talking about a little sliver of the world's population. It just happens to be that is also the sliver of the world's population that has the greatest economic and political power, and which makes the per capita contribution to global warming the worst. So that's an important sliver of the world's population. I think that the key is to understand that part of the disgust reaction to insects in general is probably a misfiring of the ectoparasite reaction. Okay. So, grasshoppers or crickets or locusts or grubs are not, ticks or leeches. They just have some superficial morphological similarities to them. So it's not that they are inherently eliciting that response, but they are an attractor in cultural evolution. That is, it's easy to get people to be disgusted by grubs, for example, because of their resemblance to leeches, and also they have other properties like they're often wet, okay, and wet things harbor more pathogens than dry things. Wet dog poop much worse than dry dog poop. I take it from somebody who's collected many, many hundreds of pounds of dog poop over the years, not for my personal collection, but because I have dogs.
Not for research.
Yeah. It is the cultural framing of the food source that is important here. And presenting the insect food products in a way that doesn't highlight morphological features that probably accidentally trigger those other kinds of disgust, the ectoparasite or the pathogen, right? So,
like a flower or...
Yeah. So, I love fried crickets or locusts. They're, it's like it's got all these great taste and texture sensations. They're crunchy, they're fatty, they're proteinaceous. It's just a wonderful combination, but it's the legs that get people. Okay. Right. So don't if you're trying to convince, it's a delicacy in many parts of Southeast Asia. They sell wonderful fried, crickets on the street in Thailand. But if you're trying to get, Americans or, Germans or such to eat crickets or locusts, don't sell them with the legs on, grind up, the whole creature, put it in a food bar, or, if you must have the whole creature, get rid of the legs and the head, right? Because those are parts that are culturally labeled as disgust eliciting because of accidental overlap, I think, right? Meat, animal meat, not insect protein, but meat itself has potential disgust elicitors, right? Because
we've learned how to package it.
Yeah, as I said, it's it's a mixed bag, right? It's been key to our species' success, but it also carries the risk of pathogen transmission. And many consumers in economically developed countries, especially in the United States. So in Europe, butchers are still commonplace in many cities, but in the United States, many Americans, their meat consumption is entirely divorced from the process of killing an animal and cutting it up into pieces, right? And that many Americans would actually be powerfully disgusted were they witness to that. I actually think that ethically, you ought not to eat meat unless you've at least witnessed, if not been part of the killing and butchering of an animal, because you ought to know what you're doing. And if you know that and you're okay with that, plenty of Americans hunt and so on, that's fine, right? But don't fool yourself into thinking that that somehow this is free of those potential disgust elicitors and the ethical concomitants of them, right? You package hamburger in a little plastic tube, ground beef in a little plastic tube. Doesn't look anything like a cow, right? It's even been, most of the blood has been removed. So, it's just, it doesn't have these properties associated with the animal, really, right? And you do the same with the locust or the mealyworm or the grub or, what you're trying to produce. And I think you can, if you can get people to the eating stage, past the disgust stage, and you can remind them and convince them that disgust seems like it's inherent. It's not, right? Yeah. We, as part of cultural organisms, we learn what to attach disgust to. Okay, so one of the reasons that my, then 9-year-old daughter could live in Indonesia for years and grow successfully despite not being able to tolerate super hot, spicy food is we could get Skippy peanut butter. Okay. And she, was a well-nourished child thanks to, and this is not product placement, but, that was the only kind of peanut butter we could get. She could get, our friends would refuse to eat the stuff. They said, that looks like baby shit. And they're right. It does look like baby shit, especially when it's melted. It looks just like baby shit, okay? You just have to learn that, to get past those potential disgust elicitors.
It's just so powerful.
Well, there's a famous disgust experiment in which subjects are given little vials of valeric acid, which is this very strong smelling chemical. If you tell the subjects this is the odor of a fine or the aroma of a fine French cheese, yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I'd really like to try that. And if you tell them this is, we've extracted this from sweaty gym socks, they're just repelled by it. It's exactly the same, molecule. Nothing is different. It's just the framing around it and what meaning we attach. And so that, we are a culture-dependent species. Our evolved psychology includes many, many mechanisms for attaching cultural meaning to things. And that means that cultural meanings can change, right? And they have changed just with regard to meat consumption, because 100 years ago, Americans did not get, de-animalized meat. That is, you were at least present at the butchering, if not, the killing of the animal. And you understood the connection between the food that you were eating and the animal that it came from. By virtue of the disgust responses, we have changed the cultural framing of that food. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, we can do all kinds of things with disgust responses as a society, depending on how we package both literally and conceptually the product at issue. And, it's only the fate of the planet here, people. So come on, right? You can think differently about other food sources.
I think, Dan, I have, you wouldn't believe how many more questions I have, but I think I have to let you go. So it's been really interesting. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure.
Well, it was wonderful talking to you, and thank you for your interest in the subject and for sharing science with the public, because ultimately, scientific knowledge should be public knowledge. It should belong to all humanity. It shouldn't be squirreled away in universities and subscription journals and private libraries. This should be, knowledge is the birthright of every person. And so thank you for sharing it.
My pleasure. You're a great speaker as well, Dan. It was
Well, they pay me to do it. It's what I do for a living. That's basically what being a professor is, just about asking questions and talking to people, really. That's
Escaped Sapiens.